Hi everyone. Thank you once again for joining in on time. We had yes, sir. So you're about to tell something?
No, nothing. Please. No. Please, bro.
Yeah. Okay. So we heard from sir for two sessions. So he doesn't need any introduction for this session. Today we'll be hearing about medical ethics. Uh, Raju, would you like to tell who are all sitting there in the eco room because so that everyone.
So we have a group of new joinees with us. So can you say your name and a brief introduction about yourself?
My name is Dr.
Raju, you will have to repeat it. It's not
Yeah.
audible.
You can just tell who all are they. That's it, so that everyone will know.
I think we have Dr. Ananthan, Dr. Sangeeta, Arun.
And who is a physiotherapist. Then Nasima, who is a nurse.
Shahida, Nasiba. Okay, Nasiba. And Soumya.
Sorry.
Soumya, sir.
Thank you, Raju. Thank
Dr. Sunil Kumar.
Yes, sir.
And hello, everybody. It is several weeks since we have met. Sridevi, hi. Sunil,
hi, sir.
Everybody else, hello again. So, to the majority, your discussions on medical ethics must have been long back when you were studying forensic medicine in third or fourth year. Very few would have had further discussions. I know that in some institutions, Kanmani, will you mute your microphone? And anybody else, for the time being, please mute your microphones. A few institutions take medical institutions take ethics seriously and discuss it at length, but the majority, for the majority in our country, that is rather India specific, ethics is confined to MBBS and then it stops. So what I'll try to do is to talk about from the point of view of palliative care. Well, I believe that whatever I am going to say is relevant for all medical practice. With that introduction, let me go on to my presentation. Someday, I will be a patient. One of you could well be the person looking after me. Suppose I have a cancer. I am going to the hospital. The hospital is giving me some advices. Go for radiation. Let the tumor shrink. Then we'll see if you are amenable to surgery. If not, we may give you some chemotherapy. And I go home. So here is a question for you. Who has the ultimate authority to take decisions on the treatment? Do you want to respond on the chat option? Is it the oncologist? Is it my son and my family? Is it myself? Who has the ultimate authority?
So there are many chats coming up saying it is the patient. It's you. It's the patient.
Okay. So long as correct. Thank you. So long as I am competent to take decisions. If that by this time I am confused, suspecting that my family is against me, they are trying to kill me, the doctor is siding with them, then of course it doesn't matter. Otherwise, thank you for recognizing that it is my right at this stage. Unfortunately, all doctors and nurses and other hospital people may not recognize this right. I will go back and take that slide away and ask you to think, what is your primary duty of care? We briefly talked about it in our first day, the introduction to palliative care. And I am bringing it back. What is the primary duty of care of the healthcare provider? And I also gave you the reference on that day. Duty of care in India is not defined by law, but it is defined by a statutory body of the Indian government. That's the Indian Council of Medical Research. It is to mitigate suffering. It is to cure sometimes. Okay, if I can be cured, you have the duty to do that. Try to do that. Relieve often, relieve my discomfort, my pain, my breathlessness, and comfort always. And the ICMR adds, there exist no exceptions to this rule. I am mentioning this because very often there's a conflict between law and ethics. Ethics is what is dictated by the medical system, by the Indian Council of Medical Research and your textbooks. The law could be in conflict. And very often, doctors have the fear that if they do not continue to do whatever is to sustain life at the expense of well-being, it is against the law. So there can be that conflict, but we'll talk about that as we go by. Is all that familiar to you? The 4 fundamental principles of medical ethics that you learned in forensic medicine. Autonomy. What is meant by autonomy? Sridevi, will you look at any chat answers?
Yeah,
And
I'll
repeat.
look at it.
What is autonomy?
If someone wants to speak, you can unmute yourself and speak,
Yes,
or others
yeah.
can type it in the chat. Patient has the right to take decision making by the patient. Right to make
Everybody
decisions and
agrees?
choices. Yeah.
Yes. Essentially, thank you very much. Essentially, autonomy is this much
Right to decide even if it is an
more
unwise
right over
decision.
the,
Sorry, sir. There was the last answer.
I may make a, okay. I mean, Sridevi, we will want to come back to that.
Yes, sir.
We will want to come back to what is to be done if my decision seems to you, to the doctor, to be unwise. Nevertheless, we go by the fact that this is my life. I have more right over this than anybody else. And if I am incompetent to take my decision, that authority automatically gets transferred to my next of kin or anybody that is legally appointed by me with a power of attorney or as by an advance directive as my proxy. So that's autonomy. Beneficence means you have to do good to me. Non-maleficence means you cannot do harm to me. And justice in this context means fair allocation of available resources. That is distributive justice. Autonomy, the right over one's own life and decisions. Beneficence, doing good. Non-maleficence, not doing harm, and justice, fair allocation of available resources. But these could be in conflict. That's a problem. Autonomy may mean, as one of you, who was it, Sridevi, who came out with the unwise decision point?
I'll just check the name. Dr. Ahmad.
Dr. Ahmad, autonomy is the overriding principle. This is my life. But if my decision is unwise and you go along with that, you are not doing good to me. Actually, you are doing harm. Whereas if somebody practically forces me authoritatively to undergo the treatment, then they are doing good to me. Maybe. But that would still be wrong. What I am saying, these various principles could be in conflict. And then your decision will have to be tempered by weighing the pros and cons, remembering that nevertheless, autonomy is the overriding principle. But autonomy and justice, any of these can be in conflict. Let me give you an example. COVID-19. So many people are now getting COVID. In the next week, even more people will get COVID, that's sure. And then hospitals will have limited capacity. Everybody requiring an artificial ventilator may not have access to it. The hospital has 20 ventilators, and then one of them is free. I am coming in, 72 years old, mild COPD, maybe other comorbidities, you don't know. And there is a young man who has no comorbidities, excellent chance of cure. The two of us both decide that we would go for the ventilator. What happens now? My decision is that I do want an artificial ventilator. I am 72, maybe I have comorbidities, I don't care. I want to fight. I want to try my best. So, I am pointing out the example. Though I said that autonomy is the overriding principle, there may be conflicts. How will you decide? I have given you a difficult problem. Will you? How many would go for the young man and leave me?
We'll go for a young man, sir. Sandeep here. A reason being,
Sandeep.
reason being, I'll go for young man. Reason being, in my decision, the chances of having young man in a healthy recovery state compared to elderly 72 with comorbidities. So benefit would go in favor of a young man. That will be my principle and overriding.
Oh my God, Sandeep, we have known each other for these few weeks, and nevertheless you are abandoning me.
I understand, sir, your state of mind, and I totally empathize with you that, and feel sorry that what decision I'm taking. I'll try my best to provide all the best what I can do for you. The chances I'm using a ventilator on you, on recovery, what I've seen in couple of months till now, would be less where I am compared to a use or the other gentleman who is there young in early teens or should be better. That's the reason. If you want to have a conversation more on it, I'm ready. I'll explain you in detail, and I'm not reserving my decision, but still I would like to listen from you, sir.
Sandeep has just, Sandeep, you are a COVID treating doctor?
I am treating a couple of them.
Okay. Rajalakshmi, I hope to talk to Sandeep over the phone at some point of time. But Sandeep, so I agree with you. If you had instead told me that the young man's life is more productive than an elderly man's, I may still have more question marks. How can you decide that? I still have productive life left. I have important things to do. That man is an alcoholic who is only causing damage to the society. How dare you? Maybe my question. Because if you always say that a young man's life is more worthwhile than an old man's, you may be accused of ageism. We are not talking of that. Sandeep is talking about beneficence and non-maleficence and justice. By giving that ventilator to me, he may actually not be doing me good. He may be causing me more harm by giving me a very painful and horrendous death. And he would be violating the principle of justice. Fair allocation of resources demands that the ventilator goes to the person who is likely to be most benefited from this. But Sandeep, you have a difficult decision now. This is what happens in medical practice. We are all forced to take very difficult decisions. Not only in COVID, everyday life. That is true. So thank you for that input, Sandeep. I would only add that if
Rajagopal sir?
not the one for research, not the institutional review board, but an ethics committee to take give clinical advices regarding what is right and wrong. With that, I'll move on. Autonomy, I am adding, can be a burden for me. You have given me all the choices. Okay. You have, I should undergo the radiation, which will shrink my tumor. Then we could see if we have the surgery, and then we can have the chemo. And if I say, doctor, I don't want radiation, well, you may say, in which case, let us see if we can shrink the tumor with chemotherapy. And then we'll reconsider. No, I want the operation now. This could be one line of thinking on the part of the patient. There can be another one. I am saying, doctor, I am confused. I don't want to make choices. You do what is best for me. And then you say, look, there are these two choices. You have to choose between one of them. And I'm saying, I can't. Doctor, I trust you. You tell me what to do. What would you do in that case? I am not willing to exercise my autonomy, that my overriding principle. I am landing it on your lap. Doctor, please tell me. Please take this decision for me. I am too confused. I don't want to have to decide. What would you do? Sandeep?
Yes, sir. What still I'm going to give him or her both the options. If you do this, what are the benefits? What are the flaws? And if you take this second decision, what are the benefit and the flaws? And what I think, if I would have been in your place, I'll choose option 1 or 2 as the what I find it well. And we'll still going to ask him again, do you understand what I'm saying? And do you think we should go by this, or you still have any more questions? That will be my approach.
What Sandeep is telling me, I could be confused because I don't have enough information. You are using words that I don't understand. Radiation. What is it? Are you going to burn my chest? And I may be confused. So as Sandeep said, you should arm me with adequate information. Enough information is my right. It's not a favor that you are doing. I need the information. And then what Sandeep recommended was what I will call a weak paternalism. That is, instead of saying, no, this is, I can't tell you, you will have to decide. You say, I mean, like a benevolent father helping a child, you say, if I were in your position, I would go for the radiation first. So what I'm saying is, autonomy doesn't mean acting like a waiter in a restaurant and giving a menu. Hey, choose. Instead, it should be supported by information and then by a little bit of benevolence, the willingness to help the person to take the decision. I might say, if I were in your position, I would go for this. And the person is demanding that recommendation, and that's what I would do. So thank you, Sandeep. In short, autonomy is not something to be exercised blindly. Then it becomes a weapon. It is instead, it is to be used with benevolence, adding a little bit of weak paternalism. That is, if I were in your position, I would do this. Okay, so where were those 4 principles of medical ethics that we mentioned? Autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice. Okay, now we are going to see if all this would really apply to Sharada. This widow, now living alone. The children are her 2 children are in the same village, married people living with their spouses and children, and she is alone in this hut. She has been told, we have a, Sharada, you need such and such treatment. You go in for radiation. And she just came back. She had gone with her son. She told her son, go, take me home. She went home and said, I don't want any treatment. She has taken the decision. She is exercising her autonomy. Coming back to what we said earlier, just blindly respecting autonomy is cruel. What would you do? Somebody else other than Sandeep? Would there be somebody who wants to suggest what you would do? Sandeep very clearly would know what to do in this case. Anybody else?
So there is a question. Have you mentioned paternalism?
What is
Dr.
paternalism? Is that the
has-
question?
No, you mentioned paternalism ? From Dr. Abhilash.
I did mention paternalism. I don't know what exactly Abhilash means. Maybe I did not explain the word enough. Paternalism is the way a parent behaves to a child, guiding the child. The autonomy, I mean, like the child says, I don't want to go to school. It is not given 100% respect. The dad will persuade the child to go. That is what I mean by paternalism. A weak paternalism is not like a strong paternalism is better go to school or I am going to thrash you. In the case of the doctor, it would be, if you don't want to do what I tell you to do, you get out. Go home. We don't want you here. That would be a strong paternalism. Whereas telling Sharada, I think you need help. Tell me, what is your fear? And then finding out what is causing her fear, trying to find a solution, and then telling her, Sharada, if you don't have the radiation, your pain will worsen, your bleeding will worsen, and hopefully you have an excellent chance of cure. So paternalism is taking that authority of a parent, nevertheless being benevolent.
So there are a few suggestions that explore the fears of the patient and
Very
active
good.
listening.
Excellent.
Explain the
Excellent.
pros
She said,
and
I don't
cons.
know. Sorry, Sri?
Another response was explain pros and cons of treatment options. Give time to patient think and discuss again.
Yes. The first point is, yeah, she is afraid. She is saying, no, I don't want it. Instead of saying, okay, if you want it, come back. Instead of that, ask, if you don't want it, there must be a good reason for this. Please tell me, what are you afraid of? And the reasons may come. And then you may be able to handle it. And if during that course of time, there is compassion in your eyes and compassion in your attitude, she may grab your hand and say, doctor, please save me. So while autonomy is to be respected, just saying, go home. If you don't want radiation, go home. That's your decision. That's blind, cruel exercising of autonomy. I have some more things to say. We do have some more time. So I do have something else to be brought up. But any questions about what I have said so far?
No, sir, nothing. No questions.
Okay, then I will have to ask the question. Beneficence, doing good, and non-maleficence, not doing harm. Can this always be achieved? Can we always do good? You know that we fail in our treatments, not infrequently. And we do cause harm. Side effects, for example. How do you reconcile with this? We have to recognize that these are ideals to be aimed at. We are not like electronic engineers who have a precise science. The parts of the machine are precise. Machines can be understood precisely, and the repair work can be precise. We are dealing with human body where the components are not even known to us precisely. Medicine, dear doctors, is not a precise science, unfortunately. We are only working by rules of averages, hoping for the best and trying to do the best. That's all we can do. We can only do our best. We cannot always be right. We will cause harm. Anaphylaxis will kill patients. Side effects may cause more harm than good. So I don't have a slide on it here. But one principle governing maleficence and beneficence is what we will call double effect.
Sir,
Where?
I'll read out a few chats in between.
Yeah,
They
yes.
are telling the pros should always outweigh the cons. Depends on how each patient responds to treatment and his or her own stresses. And someone has asked about euthanasia as per these principles.
Oh, excellent questions. Double effect. Okay, the first part. Who, I mean, you might as well read out the name also, Sri, if it is easily accessible. Whoever's mentioned about weigh the pros and cons. Do the best. There may be possibility of harm. We know that chemotherapy sometimes kills. Most of the time, chemotherapy cures or relieves. So the adverse effects can be catastrophic. There can be leukopenia and an opportunistic infection, and the person can even die. It happens. But because we believe that this is the best course to pursue, we advise the person accordingly and move forward with that. So double effect is the principle that any medical intervention, including the simplest tablet of paracetamol that you take, may have negative consequences. And as somebody mentioned, where the pros are far are outweighing the negatives, we go ahead and do it. That's the best we can do. Sri, what was the other point that was mentioned? Sorry, I forgot.
So the treatment may lead to no the patient. It depends on how each patient responds to treatment and his or her own stresses by Dr.
Yes.
Chetna.
Yes, Chetana, absolutely. That's the unfortunate part, that we are not working with machines, with human bodies, which can be unpredictable. So beneficence and non-maleficence cannot be taken for granted. We can only do our best and try to do the best for the patient. That is something that we will have to accept. Okay, I am going on to a few more points, which I believe are our core ethical obligations. May not be the four things that were mentioned here, which is there in all the textbooks. Nevertheless, particularly in our country, I believe we have to remember all this. The first is compassion. What's the difference between compassion and pity, or compassion and sympathy?
Can I say so?
Yes, please.
Compassion, I would like to put it this way. You get into the other shoes and feel that pain and try to empathize with the statement, I understand your pain, something, what you're going through.
Is that
would be.
Sandeep?
Yes, sir.
Sandeep, what you say, yes, that is empathy, right?
Yeah. Yes.
When you try to put yourself in the place of the other person, get into the other person, try to get into the other person's shoes, that is clearly empathy.
Right.
And empathy is an important part of compassion. But I'm adding, so okay, Sandeep, what you said could be totally acceptable. But let me quote Dalai Lama. Dalai Lama says, the difference between sympathy and compassion is compassion demands action. Compassion demands action. You have, especially those who have studied in government medical colleges, would know that there would be patients who do not get enough to eat. Even in corporate hospitals, they are there, borrowing, begging, borrowing, and going there. I know personally of a child being treated for cancer, where the mother-in-law and the mother were looking after the child. And one day, the mother fainted and fell down. And only then we realized that they were having one meal a day on alternate days. They didn't have enough money. Everything was spent for the chemotherapy. So today, the the grandmother would eat one meal, tomorrow the mother would eat one meal. These things happen. Pity or sympathy is saying, oh, poor things. What a tragedy. Ho, 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 ho. And walking away to our own meal. Compassion demands action. At least buy one meal for them. Or find. That's the immediate emergency management. That's only emergency management. Hey, who can help? Is there an NGO who can help? Is there a non-government organization? Doing something, or maybe taking some money out of the pocket itself, that's also emergency action. But something long-term, you can only try. You cannot always win. We will not be able to feed all the poor people that you see. But walking away without doing anything is an injustice to yourself. That's violation of compassion. Okay.
So there are a few chats again about what you have asked. Should I read it?
Yes, please.
So compassion is that we can actually understand the problem of the patient and are able to help them in some way, like you mentioned right now, said
Okay,
by
very
Dr.
good.
Chetna.
Very
And
good, Chetna.
sympathy is just to show that you care. So uh, keeping yourself in the same situation as the others. So these were the
Okay, very good.
responses.
Chetna, I am not even sure that sympathy is conveying that you care. You are not doing that. And sympathy can be very irritating when somebody is looking at you like this and say, what a miserable object, and not doing anything about it. Because if you care, you will do something about it. So, okay, thank you. So compassion is one. Respect. Sridevi and Raju, I am feeling bad because you have heard me repeat this at least 150 times. Respect is a often forgotten value in medical profession, in nursing profession, everywhere, because we are in a position of power. You are armed with all the medical knowledge, with the white coat, stethoscope hanging around the neck, the power of the institution with you, and the patient weakened, physically weakened, emotionally weakened, socially destroyed. The imbalance of power makes us sometimes forget that we are only human beings. We sometimes may be tempted to act like gods. There are how people are attending the session? Sri, why is it that I am unable to see the numbers?
48, sir.
48 people. So I am one of them. There are 47, no, much more than that. Some rooms have several people. I know that every one of you, every single person listening to me speaking now is superior to me in some way. I don't know what that way is. I know about 2 or 3 people who may have spoken, who are here. I have seen the way Raja Lakshmi holds herself with composure, carries herself so well. As a young person, new entrant to Pallium India, I remember how confident she was. Sri, I have seen how you carried your 3-month-old child to the hospital and started attending work. Sandeep, I have seen, okay, because you are a man, I can ask the question, how old are you?
54, sir.
Sandeep, you have very wise head on your shoulders. You are attending this course, and every sentence that you spoke was sheer sense. Chetana, most of the others I do not know personally, but I know you personally. I know that you have numerous qualities that I do not have. I know of your confidence. Chetana, is it okay to say what something that I know about you, about how many ramps you have walked, beauty contexts you have gone through? Listen, I know a few people. If I look hard enough in every other human being, I will find something that I do not have. That makes me treat people with respect. But sometimes I forget. Sometimes my I am age, I have gray hair, I have so much of practical expertise, I have knowledge about palliative medicine, and I have the position of chairman of Palliative India. It makes me arrogant. And in my arrogance, I may forget to be respectful to Raju. Raju, it may happen. And you, I hope you will forgive me if I have done that to you. I have no right to treat any human being with disrespect. I may find faults, I may have to do several things, but I still have to treat everybody with respect. And this is something to be remembered about patients. If you have an illiterate patients, Raju, have I exceeded time?
No, sir. You have another 10 to 15 minutes, sir.
Okay, but that's including discussion. But yeah, we did some discussion in between. Okay, but I won't take that much of time. So when there is this authority and the patient is weak, that woman, see that picture, what authority will she have? When there is an imbalance of power, there is a tendency to abuse that power and to be disrespectful. So long as I am treating with her with respect, she will treat me, she will trust me and confide in me. This woman very clearly is way above me because
Someone has unmuted, I guess.
So you can continue.
because I have lived a soft life. I am not a very strong human being, I know. She has gone through suffering, so much of suffering. And she emotionally must be 10 times stronger than I. I don't have to know the details. I treat others with respect. And treating patients with respect is not only an ethical obligation, but it makes our work easy. Because when we give respect, not only do we get respect back, but also our trust improves, relationship improves. Unless we have a good relationship with the patient, we cannot help them. Third thing is being non-judgmental. Suppose a patient was an alcoholic, was a wife beater. He even used to thrash his children mercilessly. He would spend all his money on liquor, and in the evening come back, take money from what his wife has earned and spend it all on liquor. He's lived that kind of life. Always quarreling with the neighbors, creating problems, emotionally, practically destroying the children. I would still say, I don't know him. He must be having something that I do not have. I won't respect his behavior, but I will not be judgmental with him. If he is there crying out in pain, I will remember that I have not been given the job of a judge, either by God Almighty or by the medical system. It is not in me to be judge. My responsibility and my privilege is to be kind to him. And I would also try to remember. It's not easy, I know, because I'll be remembering about his wife and children and I may be getting angry inside. But I'll try to remember that this man deserves my compassion more than anyone else, because he will not get compassion anywhere else. His wife may not be able to treat him with compassion the way he has treated her all her life, not his children. I may be the only person with the privilege of giving him compassionate care. I'll try to see him as a human being with suffering. I'll try to avoid the thought that comes into my mind saying that he's a bad man, he deserves this. Instead, I'll try to think that he needs my care more than anybody else, because nobody else will care for him. That's about being non-judgmental. I know it's not easy. It's not easy for myself. And repeatedly people have told me that of all the lessons in palliative care, this is one lesson that's hardest. And finally, about dignity. And time and again, when I see people, innocent villagers, illiterate villagers coming for treatment, I think, what dignity do they carry on them? Our hospitals and medical systems destroy their dignity. When, as the person, as this woman, she is still not crying. She is alone in that hut. She may be hungry. She is in pain. She is bleeding. But she still lives with dignity. And my hospital, I fear, may destroy that dignity. Especially if the hospital staff shouts at her. Especially if at the end of her life, I add the ultimate cruelty and indignity of a tube in every orifice and make her die a horrible death. That's violation of basic human compassion, respect, and there will be violation of dignity. So we should remember not only diseases, we should remember not only treating people with respect and compassion, we should also think that dignity is important to people in life and in death. Before I finish, I'll wind up by reminding you this sentence from ICMR. I usually include the reference there. Today I forgot. If you Google for ICMR and look for definition of we'll very gladly send you the link. And Raju, if at the end of the session there are chat questions that are unanswered like we did on the first day, I'll prepare answers and send it to them. I'll also send these important references. Thank you all very much for listening. And I don't know if Raju will, yes, Raju, I think we have 10 minutes more for discussion on this subject.
Yes, sir.
Will you allow me to speak briefly about euthanasia, because that question had come up? Who asked the question? Was it Chetna? Anyway.
No, I'll just find
Okay,
it.
doesn't matter.
Okay.
If you find the name, do tell me, Sri. This is my life. I have this disease. This is such a bother. all this radiation, chemotherapy, going to hospitals. What kind of a life is this? I've decided that enough is enough. I've lived a good life. I'm 72. I've received a lot of love from so many people. Lived a good life. Time. Bye-bye. Doctor, whoever asked that question.
Dr. Anmol has asked questions.
Sorry?
Dr. Anmol.
Animal. Dr. Animal. Thank you not only for asking the question. Now please do this for me. This is my life. This is my right. Please put in something. I know that if you put in 20 ml of 10% potassium chloride into my vein, I will die any quick death. It will be painless. In 8 seconds, I will be gone. Doctor, do it please. This is my right. Animal, are you willing to respect my autonomy? Please try to answer your own question.
Sir, hello.
Yes.
Sir, as a doctor, I feel that we should not be encouraging euthanasia. But this question has always come to my mind that in certain countries it is being legalized. It is legal in some countries. So, what could be the reason why they were actually the autonomy is being taken so seriously in those countries? I feel as a doctor, we should always be against a loss of life rather than aid in a patient losing his life, because you never know what kind of lessons suffering will offer us during an illness.
Anymore, you have brought out one important point. That's the conflict between ethics and law. Animal, why don't you make yourself visible? It's better to talk to a face rather than to a black screen. Anyway, as I said in the beginning, yes, Animal, where are you from? Can't hear you.
I'm from Trivandrum, sir.
Okay. Hope to meet up someday.
Yes. Sure.
Animal, I said in the beginning that there can be a conflict between ethics and law.
Yes.
Euthanasia is illegal in our country. If I, because of respect for autonomy, etc., I kill somebody, it will be murder. It is not even manslaughter. It's willful murder. And I am liable to be convicted for murder. That's a law. So the question doesn't really arise. Immediately we can say, no, this is not possible. It is illegal. I will not do it. But the ethical part is something else. So let us not confuse the legality. If you were living in Netherlands or Switzerland, where it's legal, you will still say, no, we shouldn't do it. And I am asking, why not? I have a life which I believe is worse than death. I am suffering. And there's no point. And who are you, Dr. Animal, to decide on what I should do? This is my life. Law permits euthanasia. That is, if you are in Netherlands or Switzerland. I demand my right. Okay. Why do you say that you still cannot do it? Is it a religious belief?
No, not really, sir. I feel that as a patient, I'm not, I'm not sure whether I'm in a position to judge, but I feel in general, the human condition, you cannot really know what the human condition is going to teach you. Maybe that suffering during the illness is a lesson that is in store for you. I know it is kind of in the spiritual realm, but still.
Thank you, Animal. We have a difficulty here. I remember I was practicing, I was an anesthetist already in the 1970s when abortion was legalized in India. The medical termination of pregnancy was legalized with conditions. I remember what happened. So many gynecologists said, I am not going to do it. This cannot be done. This is destroying a human life. I won't be party to it. That was for the first year. By the second year, the vast majority of them had started doing it because it became norm. It became social norm. And when it was the 90s, I know of only one doctor, gynecologist, who still said, I won't do it, and refused to do it. So the way animals thinking may change with what is considered social norm. That usually happens. But having said all that, one, it is illegal in our country. Two, animal, this thing about philosophically, is it right or wrong, is not what concerns me more. What concerns me most, if this person say there is a comment from Mohammed Sunil.
Sir,
I
can you
will say,
unmute your mic, sir?
Sorry, Raju, thank you. For Dr. Mohammed Sunil says, I will say, I wish I could help you. Instead of saying this hospital roads doesn't allow me to inject it, I would ask him what makes him wish to die. And
Dr.
try to
Sandeep is
find the inner
asking-
pain. Yes, wait a second, Sri. Let me complete that sentence. Mohammed Sunil, I would ask him what makes him wish to die and try to find the inner pain. Animal, hear that. That is precisely it. What I should do is not immediately jump into the question of euthanasia. Hey, that's not legal. That cannot be done. We are not murderers. We are here to save people, not to kill people. That would be the wrong thing to do, because here is a human being crying out, please help. I would look at every request of euthanasia as a cry for help. The person is saying, my life is worse than death. I don't want to live like this. And if you, Sandeep, or Anamol, or Muhammad, or somebody sits down by me, looks me in the eye, maybe hold my hand and say, obviously life is very hard for you. You want to talk about it? Then all my stories will come out and you may find a way of overcoming my suffering. So very clearly, looking at the elements of suffering and solving them is the main thing. Most of the time, Sridevi and I, Sunil, everybody would be very familiar with this. Every year, a few people come to us asking to be killed. And almost everybody, at the end of 2 or 3 days, sits up and has breakfast and give us a smile when their element of suffering is treated. Having said that, there will be some people in whom we cannot do that. I recognize that. There will be a few people, particularly with social issues or very difficult physical issues or emotional issues, in whom we cannot improve the quality of life. So in answer to that question about is euthanasia, can it be done? I would say that's the first question is, how can we improve his quality of life? And then comes the philosophical question, legal, it is not legal, no. And Vinay Somya asks, is it logical to kill if it is legal? Okay, I will not go into the philosophical question. This session is not about euthanasia. But Sandeep, what if the patient is unable to take decision? Are the family members authorized to make that decision about euthanasia? In those countries where it is legalized, if the patient has left an advance directive, then a proxy that named by him. Suppose I have written my advance directive that my son can make decisions on my behalf if I am incompetent, then only they are able to take that decision. Otherwise, no one else can take that decision about euthanasia. But before 4 p.m., Sandeep, it is time to go on to the next section. But quickly, your comment. Sandeep has asked, can I comment in discussion?
Yes,
Your
sir.
comment, and then Raju and Sri will go on to the case presentation.
So, yes, sir. Thanks. You had almost answered my discussion point, but I'll try to reiterate. Holding a hand of yours, the touch has started a communication. The question of euthanasia, in particular in India, it should not have been risen. When we compare the West in terms of Switzerland or Netherlands, where everybody can go and get it done, they had achieved the health services, the services to an extent, to utmost level we can talk about. We are not able to provide even the basic care. We should not talk about it. It's my personal view on debate about euthanasia till we have achieved that. And as you rightly said, touch into your hand and look into the eyes, you will find 99.9% of answers to resolve something. Yes, 0.1% we don't have. Thank you, sir.
I am not sure about the percentages, but totally agreed, Sandeep. In India, that's an important point. I also agree with you on a moral ground that we have not deserved the right to discuss euthanasia till we are able to relieve suffering. If somebody is in dreadful pain and screaming in pain and saying, please kill me, I can't bear the pain, not treating the pain and instead of saying, lie down, let me kill you, is certainly not civilized. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me patiently for a phenomenal discussion. Thank you for your participation. And Sri, Raju, thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Can we move on to the presentation, Raju?
Yes, sir. Dr. Susan?
Yeah, hello.
Yes, we can hear you, doctor. You can start your presentation.
Okay, am I audible to all?
Yes, you are.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you, sir, for the wonderful discussion that we had. And so, for today's case presentation, I'm working as a medical officer at Baptist Christian Hospital, Tezpur, in Assam, and we'll be presenting the case of a 60-year-old male. He was diagnosed to have carcinoma of the left buccal sulcus.
Dr. Susan, are you there? We can't hear you now.
While Susan's bandwidth is low, it says while she comes back, Sri, would you like to read out the diagnosis?
Yes, so diagnosis is carcinoma left gingivo-buccal sulcus with lung and skeletal metastasis, status post-marginal mandibulectomy and status post-radiotherapy, ongoing chemotherapy with right-sided malignant pleural effusion, query infected pleural effusion, and he is come for management. Next slide.
Oh my
Uh,
God.
Sorry.
Hello,
Okay.
can everyone
No,
hear?
Susan, we have read the case. Yes, please go on.
Yeah. Okay, so he presented to us with fever and breathing difficulty for the last 15 to 16 days. So he came to us on the 15th of June and he was diagnosed in September 2019. He underwent surgery, radiotherapy, chemotherapy, and then in April 2020 he started having dyspnea and he underwent out in Guwahati, he underwent pleural tapping, CT scan found metastasis, pleurodesis was done. And then finally, he came to us with fever, breathing difficulty, high grade fever, and chest pain. He was started on injection meropenem and then sent to a peripheral center for further management, saying that he couldn't undergo chemo at that time. Next slide, please. So he was admitted and we did an assessment and we found that he was requiring oxygen. Saturation was 92% at 3 liters and he kept having fever. So he also had pain, weight loss, tiredness. He was unable to swallow due to dribbling of food. So he was put on an NG tube. He also had diabetes for the last 13 years. Next slide, please. uh, right side of the right side of the lung showed uh, bronchial breath sounds and crepitations, and right side decreased air entry, which led us to diagnose him to have pleural effusion. And counts, next slide please. Counts were raised. It showed sepsis. Blood culture, however, showed no growth. We started him on Piptas. Next slide. So we sent cultures, and as we were waiting for the reports, uh, on day 2, he started having worsening of saturation. And even though we knew the diagnosis and we explained to the relatives that he has a poor prognosis, they were still keen on intubating the patient, saying that they wanted to wait for the elder daughter to come back. And so, despite all discussions, we had to go ahead with the intubation, and we had to put him on ventilator. We did a CT which showed pleural effusion with lymphangitis carcinomatosis, and we also started him on meropenem. Next slide, please. We were pleural analysis showed a hemorrhagic tap. There were occasional pus cells, no bacteria. Next slide. So we couldn't find any, we were initially wanting to put a drain and take out the effusion, but we realized that since there's no empyema, it wouldn't help much. We were able to wean him off the ventilator by the 20th of June. But however, after discussion, we explained to the relatives that since if he requires further intubation, that wouldn't be very helpful for the patient. And so we discussed with them, and we thought it was the best option to, rather than re-intubating the patient, to let him go to the ward and be with the family. However, for the breathlessness, we started him on tablet morphine, and he was shifted to the ward and on oxygen, few basic medications. Next slide, please. Now, this is his last day in the hospital. So we've initially taken a verbal consent, and finally on the 22nd morning, we took a written consent, and we discussed with the relatives. We decided to keep fluids as well as oxygen at minimal flow for the breathlessness, which was getting very distressful for the patient as well as the relatives, because they kept seeing him struggling, and they continuously kept coming back to us saying, please do something. And then we had to again explain to them the entire situation, and finally they understood. Written consent was given. We gave tab morphine 5 mg, and with that the patient became a bit more calm, and a lot of other relatives had also come, and so he was surrounded by his family in this last few hours. And we asked the hospital chaplain and the team, and they went and prayed for the patient and their family. And finally, at around 3:15 p.m., he passed away in the ward without any IV fluids, without oxygen, surrounded by his family members and relatives. His wife, since the beginning, was very reluctant to take active participation, which caused all the prolonged stay, we believe, because they kept refusing to take the patient home. And he had two daughters. The younger daughter had left her teaching job to be with her father, and he had an elder daughter who was married. He himself was an ex-serviceman in the police at quite a high post, and he was initially found to have feelings of depression, anxiety, fear of death. Next slide. These are his medications: Pantop, Optineuron, some laxatives, his sugar medications, meropenem, and morphine. Next slide, please. So the main concern was the breathing difficulty which he came with, and in the last stages when we had to stop everything. As also, since even in the beginning the patient was, his speech wasn't clear, and when we extubated him also, we couldn't talk properly to the patient. Even when we tried to get him to write, his handwriting wasn't clear, so it created a lot of communication barriers. Next slide. So, so this was a 60-year-old male who came to us with this condition, and initially he was managed with an interventional approach because the relatives wanted to go all out and do everything possible. And then finally, when we couldn't, we realized that it wasn't going to do much benefit. We changed back to the palliative approach, and and the patient passed away in the ward of medical interventions and surrounded by his family. So the discussion points are whether it was a good decision to intubate the patient in the first place. Was it the right presentation? Was it the right decision to continue or not continue mechanical ventilation any further? How could we have managed the distressful breathlessness during the last stages, and the role of IV fluids and oxygen in the last stages? When should we have taken consent, and how could we have taken, what was the right timing, and our inability to discuss with the patient and get him to express his wishes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Susan, for coming up with such a patient story, very elaborate, and so many discussion points, which is quite relevant for today's discussion. So before asking Dr. Rajgopal, I would like to hear from the other participants. What do they think about these discussion points? Decision to intubate, and what about the decision to not to continue mechanical ventilation? You can either unmute yourself or you can type it in the chat session. What do you think?
Dr. Sandeep?
Yes, Dr. Sandeep.
Yeah, and this particular nice case presentation with a lot of thought-provoking issues. As from onset, we had a little elaborate on the disease process was there. So, would it was a mandated necessary by the medical fraternity to keep him on a mechanical ventilator at that time? Two things comes into play again: the physical and psychological trauma to patient and the family members, and plus the monetary cost, either to directly or indirectly. This is going to benefit to the patient there. Is going to help in his suffering. That would I would have taken into consideration first. I understand, and the disease process is at such advanced, more of a uh, elevation of suffering would be probable. Just putting an oxygenation and symptomatic care would have been thought of in my point of view. Thank you.
There are a few chats also regarding that. Patient is critical, not in a position to give, to voice his autonomy. From Dr. Anupama. And Dr. Abhilash is telling he should not have been intubated, started a cascade of events leading to more suffering. And Dr. Sabida is thinking that decision to intubate was mainly to help the patient and family to prepare for death and for the daughter to come. Any thoughts about that? Because Dr. Susan was mentioning the intubation was mainly done for that, so that the daughter has to come and see him before he passes away, and it bought more time for the family to understand that he's dying probably. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's right. We intubated him because they wanted to do their best for the patient and also to get time for the elder daughter to come.
Dr. Joy has also commented that it was a good decision. It was fair enough to ventilate him as the daughter wanted to see him, and it buys more time so that everyone can sink in. So many again, Dr. Chetna is telling that intubation was the right decision. It is justified so as to ease of his death and for family members to be mentally prepared. Sir, we would like to hear from you about the same. Most of them who have typed in the chat session agreeing that it was fair enough decision to ventilate the patient because they needed more time to sink in, and the daughter has to see.
Susan, congratulations for the preparation of this report. Excellent, very relevant also, and a very common situation. And under the circumstances, you did a lot. And the thought crossed my mind that maybe I would like to be treated by somebody like you. But there are, I mean, like in all ethical matters, there are two sides to everything. Sri, for us also, this situation is very common, isn't it? Family wanting one thing. The first question is, was it ethical to cause suffering for that person? No doubt, at that stage of the illness, intubation and ventilation is suffering. I know, I am an anesthetist, I was an intensivist, I have worked and seen how people suffer. Even if you sedate them reasonably, which is not usually done in our ICUs, some are, yes, it is still suffering. So for the family's sake, was it fair to allow the person to suffer? First question. Well, we may, for 18, we may not have a lot of time to hear a lot of comments, but as often happens, this is a conundrum that we face. We don't know what to do right the best. The easy answer I'll give you. The man was in no state, he was not competent to take a decision. We have to go by what the family says. We did it. Okay, the daughter wants to come. It will take 3 days for her to come from San Francisco. And so the man is kept alive. Is that fair? How would I feel if I am suffering there and you are causing suffering to me so that my child can come and see me? I am prepared to do a lot for my children, but not to go through that kind of suffering. Well, these are issues, conflicts. And as you did, Susan, we also very often end up in this situation where we may not be ventilation because we are in a palliative care service, but we do things more for the family than for the patient. This is a dilemma, I agree. What is the answer? How can we prevent this kind of event? Sri, this is a lesson for us also. We don't do this enough. The essential thing is to start these discussions early. We don't. We wait till the man is almost dead and then initiate the discussion. If, ladies and gentlemen, if I am the patient tomorrow, as I am sitting in front of you in the consultation room, please ask me, look, let us hope we are able to resolve this crisis and that you get over the problem. We will give you the antibiotic. We'll do this, this, and this, and let us hope that things will get better. But very often, sometimes, while we are preparing for the best, hoping for the best, we may not achieve it. It's a good practice to prepare for the worst also. I want to know just what kind of thoughts do you have in the event that we may not be able to make you feel better. Suppose your condition does deteriorate. What is it that you would want? Now, of course, this cannot be the first communication. If all of a sudden you come to me and start talking to them about my death, I'll be angry. This has to be part of an ongoing communication. If you know me as a human being, you will know when to ask this. And this should have been done long back. And then the family also gets time to adapt to it. Plans are made. And very often this argument early enough works. Tell the children, look, I know you all love your mother. Let us also make sure that we do things best for her and not because somebody else wants it that way. Let us have it clearly understood that we will be always acting in the best interest of your mother to minimize her suffering and to do the best for this. These discussions often help. The trick is to start the discussions early, find out from the person what he or she wants, bring it up to the whole family, and arrive at decisions early. It doesn't always work, but you know in medicine that nothing works all the time. But going by this approach, we are able to do the best for a lot of people. Under the circumstances where the man those advanced care planning was not made, where the man became incompetent to take the decision and was breathless, we had to go by what the family was deciding. And then we had to continue to work with him. And Susan, you did your best. You did your best, and at the end, you initiated enough discussions so that a second intubation that would have been pointless infliction of suffering was avoided. And I am glad the daughter came and saw the man.
Dr. Mohammed Sunil, he wants to ask something. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask?
Dr. Mohammed Sunul, can you unmute and speak?
I think he's typing in the chat session. If doctors felt that intubation would not help, but family insist on intubation, can we refuse?
Sri, considering the time, we may not find a good answer today. This is something that we must discuss when we discuss end-of-life care. This is an important question. We mentioned what's the medical healthcare provider's duty of care. Remember, it is to mitigate suffering. It is to cure sometimes, relieve often, and comfort always. It is not to keep the heart beating for one more week on a ventilator. In this case, this person with advanced cancer, with a pleural effusion, possibly an empyema, his chances of survival with any reasonable quality of life was infinitesimally small. So, why bring it up at all? I don't know if you have, many of you have heard the recent discussions and the ICMR document on DNR that was brought in recently, and the All India Institute of Medical Sciences guidelines. What's our purpose of treatment? If you are not going to improve quality of life, if all that you achieve is prolonging the period of suffering by a week, why should we do it? So if there is, this is where a basic problem lies. We in the medical profession are confused. We don't know what's our duty. If we knew what was our duty and if it was universally discussed and accepted, we would be saying, look, this is the time when he needs to be with you all. please, at least those who can spend time, come and stay in his room and spend time with him. Let us find out what all he wants. Are there any wishes that he had that needed to be done? And let us all talk about how we can keep him comfortable. We should not be bringing up the question of ventilation. If I am dying, please don't do it. What's the point in ventilation? Just because that ventilator is there and you know how to intubate, why should you push it down my throat when it's not going to help me? This decision right at the moment you are not able to do, because in our country, these discussions did not happen in time. Therefore, globally, we have come to a state where we have to protect ourselves against our colleagues by writing advance declarations, living wills, getting them notarized, etc. So I am not leaving it with a final decision here. I am ending by saying that I believe the duty of the medical profession is not to ventilate this person. And that should not be brought up by the medical system initially, that choice. If the family insists, I accept. And secondly, I believe the discussion should have been initiated early. And finally, if the person is not competent, if it is a reasonable option, we may have to abide by the decision of the family. And a final point, if you are convinced, if it's non-controversial matters, this will not work. If you are convinced that this is bad for the person, you have the right to hand over care to somebody else. I can't do this. I can't intubate his trachea. This is unethical. I will not do it. You can get another doctor. But this is theory, not easy to practice, because you will be, there's no time for the family to accept that. Sorry that I am not giving very clear, definite answers. There are maybe no very clear, definite answers here. We have an ethical dilemma globally, and particularly in our country. This will have to be further discussed and decisions taken.
So there were questions on breathlessness and IV fluids. I hope we'll be covering that during the end of life care session. Or would you like to take it up now?
Susan, if I am the patient there, I wouldn't want that intravenous. No, okay, patient wouldn't know what to require. But I don't think intravenous fluids in a dying patient are mandatory. On the other hand, they generally cause more suffering, especially towards the end of life when your immunity is low, thrombophlebitis happens, and people die with pain over both arms and both legs because of numerous IV infusions. Sometimes it is necessary for quality of life to treat dehydration. And one of the sessions, I am sure, before we are through the course, will deal with subcutaneous infusion of fluids. At best, that's what we do. I would not put in an nasogastric tube to a terminally ill patient for nutrition. It doesn't make sense.
So much, sir. Is there any pressing question, Dr. Susan, or anyone else before we wind up? We have just 1 more minute to wind up the session.
And how about the breathlessness, sir?
You did it in the end, Susan. You gave the perfect treatment. You gave morphine, low-dose morphine. If necessary, we may add other medicines. We'll treat breathlessness symptomatically. It must be treated. What we do, I am saying only what we actually practice. Terminal breathlessness is managed by a small dose of morphine. There's a range. Maybe it may go up to 10 milligrams 4 to 6 hourly, but usually start at 2.5 milligrams 6 hourly. And if it is still causing intense breathlessness, we may have to add a benzodiazepine, enough to relieve the distress. And if you are asking me, will the combination of benzodiazepine and morphine not cause respiratory depression? My answer is not at the doses that I would employ.
Okay. And sir, I'd like to add that the decision to give morphine was like taken after I listened to your second session, which
I'm
was really
glad.
helpful.
I am glad that purely out of a classroom session, you actually practiced it, and I am glad you were able to make his end a little better than it was. So glad that the family was with him, and that is one blessing that I would seek for myself. And one final message, Sri, I'm taking exceeding time, I know. Any one of the 47 people listening to this, if you are able to think about your own end, your own death, maybe you should put into a few lines and write down how you would want your end of life care to be. Just write it down. You may send it across, but let us certainly have it to be useful for the discussion on end of life care. Those who are able to think about one's own mortality, one's own ending, are usually able to help others much better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, all the participants and the ECHO team from Pallium for today's session. There is a link in the chat session for feedback, so kindly give in your feedback before you leave. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you, Dr. Susan, for wonderful presentation today, and everyone for your active participation through chats. See you next week again.
Thank you all. Bye bye. See you next Wednesday with a topic on difficult pain taken by Dr. Rajawal. Thank you.